I'm DJ Cole. I'm a technical marketing engineer with Cisco. And today I'm here to present one of our newly announced product series, the IE3100 Rugged Series switches. In prepping for this presentation, I was trying to come up with a catchy title for the first part, other than just industrial networking. But really, in the reality, this is a switch. It switches. It's just like our other switches that switches from a technology standpoint. But really, the innovation on this switch is really from the form factor, right? So in our industrial networking group in Cisco IoT, what we try to do is take the same Cisco technology that you have in our routers, that you have in our switches, that you have in our wireless, and we bring that more towards the industrial setting, right? So, while you have the same technology, you can't just take like an enterprise rack mount switch and put that in an industrial environment, right? That's things like manufacturing plants, oil and gas, wind farms, ports and terminals, lots of different use cases that we have where it's a little bit hard to just take that enterprise equipment and put it in there. So that's kind of what we specialize in, is that industrial grade equipment. And with that, you get extended temperature ranges, right? More than you would get in an enterprise switch. So some of our products go up to 75 Celsius. It depends on the product line, of course. And a lot of the certifications that you have, right? We have certifications for oil and gas where we have explosion and HAZLOT ratings. We have certifications for rail for certain products, for vibration, and a number of different certifications depending on what it is. We also have some additional support in our products for industrial protocols that are kind of specific to different use cases. And I'll touch on some of those as we kind of introduce this product. But I do have one here. There's a few different models, but I'll go through that during the presentation. So sort of in our industrial lineup of switches, we kind of have a few different form factors, right? We actually have rack mount switches, and those are for some use cases like utilities might have in a substation, among other things. And even though those are rack mount switches, some of them still even have vibration ratings. Matter of fact, in Cisco, we actually support something called the Indy Autonomous Challenge in Cisco IoT. And one of these use cases we actually had for this rack mount switch was putting that in an Indy-like race car that was powered by an autonomous driver going around a racetrack at 100 miles per hour, actually over 100 miles per hour, up to 180 miles per hour on an oval track. And some of the vibration certifications is the reason why we chose that rack mount switch. Most of our portfolio, in terms of the number of models that we have, is actually in this DIN rail section, and that's the section of the portfolio that we're announcing this week, a new model of switch for. And then we also have some switches that are actually IP67, and those IP67 switches are kind of focused for environments where you might need something that you can't put inside of an enclosure. Sometimes those environments are outside. Sometimes they're inside of a manufacturing facility where you can't put it inside of an enclosure for a number of different reasons, but you can still have it there and just plug things directly into it using IP67 connectors. So inside of that DIN rail kind of series of switches, we have a few different kind of tiers of switches in our product family, right? We have the IE3400, the 3400, the 3300, and the 3200, and those are all sort of different tiers, different levels of feature sets. The same thing that you would see sort of in our enterprise switches, right? You have like the 9200, the 9300 catalyst switches, different tiers, different functionality, kind of targeted for different use cases. We have the same thing using sort of the same technology underneath inside of our IE portfolio. But one thing that we're sort of refreshing in our portfolio is sort of that the lower end of it, or the more compact switches, where you need networking, but you don't necessarily need all the features, and you need it in some of a little bit smaller form factor to fit some applications. So with that, we have some space there for something new, right? And I'm here to tell you what that new thing is today. So I think I introduced it at the very beginning, but this is our new series of IE3100 switches. It's really purpose-built from the hardware perspective for things that are sort of at the edge of your network, right? So we see a lot more advancements in technology and industry where you need something that's a little bit smaller and you need it at a better kind of form factor than we have in our lineup today, right? So things that you would see this on are things like AGVs that move around, right, where you're kind of space constrained and you run on battery power. Maybe you're extending your network to more places and you need something that's a little bit more compact than you could do before. Or maybe you're using an unmanaged switch in some of those areas, which is kind of common in industrial settings today. And now you're worried more about the security and the features of your network, and you want to integrate it more into your Cisco environment. You would use something like this, right? That's small, that's compact, but still has that same Cisco technology underneath. And of course, so another section that we sort of see a lot of use in, sort of I have a lot of experience in that because I came from that industry, is actually amusement parks, theme parks, sort of that themed entertainment world, where you can use a lot of these switches going out into smaller environments where you need some of that more visibility at the edge than you could get with an unmanaged switch. That's critical in sort of any industry that sort of deals with life safety or critical process control. So with that, I've talked a lot about how it's kind of compact. And really kind of how we benchmark what is compact is based on sort of our prior generation of switches that we're kind of upgrading and replacing, right? So we have a generation of switches called the IE2000 series. Those are kind of built on the last generation of Cisco technology, and we're kind of upgrading that place in our catalog with this new switch. In doing that, we're actually able to keep some of the same features, the feature set. We're actually able to increase the feature set in certain areas, and we're able to decrease the volume and both the weight of those products with this new series by keeping the same technology and actually upgrading that switch from an iOS-based switch to an iOS SE-based switch. We have a few different sizes. This actually goes across 5 different models. So depending on, don't want to necessarily bore you with all the details. Feel free to ask questions, that part, but there's a mapping between our previous portfolio and our current portfolio, and those kind of match these 3 different sizes that you have and how they map back to the previous class of product. I think some of the features on our switches, as I mentioned, same technology that you would expect in a Cisco switch, but there are some features that we add sort of that are very kind of industry specific, and I think really make the difference between our product and what you would get with a different product or an unmanaged switch, definitely. As I mentioned at the very beginning, at the base level, it's a switch that switches, so there's not a huge change there, right? And that's kind of how we target this switch, right? A lot of organizations are kind of going through the process of kind of OT, IT, merging, or definitely the OT, the operational side of things, really has to kind of concern themselves more with things like security and auditing and just visibility and what's happening in their industrial network. And those skills really come from the IT side of things, and those people are familiar with Cisco products. They're familiar with switches in general out in industry, and they sort of expect the same thing when they come into the industrial portfolio, especially on the Cisco side, right? That's where they go look for it. So a lot of the features that we have are very similar, but we add a few, right? In terms of reliability, all of our switches come with kind of dual inputs, and that's kind of similar to what you'd see with a rack mount switch, but in a DC world, that allows you to have like 2 different DC power supplies to supply the switch. You have some I/O, so you can actually share some like alarms from the switch, right? So anything that this generates in terms of alarms, you can share with kind of a contact closure to an external system. We support an interesting feature called L2 NAT, which is very similar to sort of normal NAT like you'd have in port-based or static NAT, but it's a little different in terms that actually happens on the interface level. So you're able to change IP addresses from the interface level onto a different network, right? And where you would use that is in a lot of automation. Things are still kind of they're definitely very statically set, right? Where a system may have, you might have different AGVs in a plant, and all those AGVs are addressed like 192.168.0.1, and all of them are the same. And as you bring that onto your wireless, you do that L2 NAT, so you're able to translate those addresses to an IP address that fits with the rest of your facility. And you're able to do that in a way that is much more simpler than trying to do it with other types of NAT. And that's all happened at the interface level on the switch, depending on which model that you have. Some of the other things I think that really stand out, and this is things that, during my career, kind of doing some of this stuff in industry, is really the ability to swap an SD card on the switch. When I was first starting in one of our previous generation of the switches, that was the IE3000, which is kind of like the precursor to this a while ago. That switch actually had CF cards to do this, right? So the idea being that, these are supported by technicians out in the field, right? And those technicians, they may be mechanics, they may be, electrical engineers, but they definitely don't have a strong IT background. But those are the people who at 2 a.m. when this device fails in some critical system, maybe a power plant or water treatment plant or whatever else that can be really critical, those are the people that have to go out and replace this switch when it fails, right? And they don't have a laptop. well, they may have a laptop, but they don't have the console cable, and they're not going to sit there and redo the configuration. But if all that failed was the switch, you're able just to take that SD card out, put it in a same model switch, and it will boot off that SD card and have all the configuration ready that was already on that switch, right? So they can get back up and running as quick as possible, and then a network engineer can go in there and make sure everything's fine the next day, maybe program a new SD card or whatever, and just, but they can check it out later, but they were up and running when they needed to be up and running.
I have one question to the feature set. Can you do full 802.1x NAC on these devices?
Yep. So like dynamic VLAN assignment, all that, that's something that, before I worked for Cisco, the company I worked for was definitely onto that. We used it fully across our network with ICE. So, depending on how we wanted to assign something, we would assign them to the correct VLAN and do all that.
Especially when I look at it from a pen tester perspective, these boxes that are somewhere when maybe in a facility where nobody is on site in a tower or somebody, it's ideal to drop kind of a remote box, and connect to the network. So it's cool that you can cover that,
I think you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Okay, he's gonna start to sing. Wait.
So one thing I would say just to that question too is, with some of our other switches, not necessarily these ones, and some of our industrial routers, we're looking at implementing MACsec right on the device because, especially in the utility world, we have a lot of that remote equipment. And to your point, right, not only the port security, but they want to secure that link between the switch and that remote device. So even implementing MACsec in the field is something that a lot of our customers are really interested in. You had a comment?
Yeah, I think the main point I wanted to add is that this switch also has the same iOS XE that is available on the Catalyst switches. So most of the features, depending on the range of switches which we have, it supports those features.
And I think also the MACsec is absolutely good because it is these lines where somebody just plugs in, I don't know, an old school hub to double all the traffic or get a nice sniff and see maybe your passwords and so on. So I think it's a good feature request.
Well, specific to MACsec, what I would say is that it's not available on 3100s, but in the family, when we have 3200s, it supports MACsec 128, and in 33 and 34, we also support MACsec 256.
Wonderful.
Yep.
All right.
I think specifically to your point, remote equipment, one of the types of customers we see is utilities, because they have a lot of remote equipment at different sites, and there is no security at that, right? It's the enclosure, and they want to have that visibility on the line. But again, not specific to this switch, but specific to some of our catalogs. So those are the types of features that we're looking at. But on these specific switches, 802.1x and all the ports. So if you unplug the port and you plug that in, you're not going to get the same level of privilege as you would a PLC or something would. Definitely critical in those.
You're often surprised in this IoT field how many stuff still have telnet, with unencrypted passwords. It's unbelievable,
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And if it's not telnet, then it's just admin, and that's a lot of the industrial things, right? And to go on to some of our portfolio, we have a product called CyberVision that we do a lot of industrial stuff with that tries to identify some of that stuff, because a lot of the customers, some of this stuff may have been developed before them or done by a vendor, and they might not even have visibility to that. So being able to do that and see that is kind of critical to our entire portfolio of how we would address industrial use cases like that. Yep, so let me continue. Got off track there a little bit. So next slide, basically what you were asking for, right? 802.1x on the ports, layer 2 security. We also support some SDA features on the switches, depending on which model it is across our portfolio. So you can integrate that into DNA Center and do a little bit more of that segmentation than you could do, with specifically older switches that didn't do any SDA and only did VLANs, but a lot in comparison to switches that are unmanaged, right? And that's, I think, the vast majority of a lot of systems out there today that are getting more visibility on them are things with just, unmanaged switches. You plug in, you get the same level of privilege as all the control system components on that. Kind of looking at the models, right? I talked about 5 different models. Depending on the model that you pick, you get some of those extra features, and really that has to do with the ASIC and the FPGA that's on the kind of the advanced level switches. A lot of this technology we borrow from some of our enterprise catalog of switches, and we purpose build that as best as we can. We have to make some decisions in terms of kind of hardware compatibility in terms of the temperature ranges, right? Because some of those industrial components can't be used one-to-one because they have to they have to be subjected to testing and stuff at the higher temperatures. So we make a little bit of change, but more or less, we have to make the features very similar to what you'd have on an enterprise switch. Here's just some pictures for comparison, sort of. This is one of our previous IE2000 switches, so this is kind of the product generation that this will eventually replace. It doesn't look like a lot in size, but when you're dealing with industrial control cabinets, it can be a pretty big deal. I worked on a project before. By the time you put one of these IE2000 switches in a cabinet and then you plug cables in the front of it, and say you may have 16 or 20 cables coming out of one of these switches, it was either the choice of make the panel bigger, or in the end, we couldn't do that because of the space constraints we had. We actually cut a section of the panel out and welded a new section that just stood out a little bit, just so you had the extra little, probably about ½ an inch, so the cables wouldn't have to bend too tight off the switch. So that little reduction in the depth of the switch and sort of the overall size can make a big difference in these industrial environments. Again, sort of on the top, some other things we've heard from our customers sort of on the switch is just the overall weight. So not just size, but also weight of the switch. A lot of what we do in terms of ruggedizing these switches is focused on the sort of the thermal element, right? So a lot of our switches have to deal with dissipating heat with no fans, and doing so at warmer temperatures than you're used to with industrial equipment. So a lot of those switches have a lot of heat sink, right? So the entire outside case is aluminum. Some of them have fins. And then looking at these sort of different scenarios on how you deploy this switch a little bit differently is, there is a slight reduction in sort of the temperature range, but when you're dealing with these kind of small switches, especially indoor environments, you don't need as wide of a range, and you're more focused on, if I'm putting this on an AGV or in a cabinet, how much does it weigh, right? Maybe taking a little bit off the weight in terms of that is a good kind of trade-off in terms of size and factor. Along with that, we also made a few changes on the kind of the back of the switch, which this is sort of getting the technical details, so feel free to ask questions at the end if you want to hear a little bit more about this or something else. But one of the things on that kind of switch that I talked about that's all aluminum, has a lot of heat sink, is sort of the DIN rail mount bracket. A lot of our customers kind of expressed that they don't always use DIN rail, right? And DIN rail is a standard in industry to mount things in panels. They don't always use that. And on the previous switch, it was actually integrated into the back of the switch, right? Which also made the switch kind of sit kind of crooked when you didn't use that DIN rail mount and you just sat it on a table. So if you're integrating this into something small or a cabinet, maybe a traffic controller where you don't use DIN rail, or onto an AGV, that kind of was just in the way, added more weight. So we actually changed the design on this switch and went with a removable DIN rail connector on the back. So you can actually use that, put it on if you need it, take it off if you don't. Again, a lot of systems don't use that, so you're able to do that, and you don't have that extra sort of thing on the bottom that kind of makes your switch a little different. With that sort of kind of concludes what I had prepared, so happy to take any questions you may have now.
So it can take heat, it is rugged, it can vibration. Have you considered to send it to space?
I don't know if we'd send this one to space, right? So we've definitely taken other portfolio switches to things like race cars and things like that. I think we definitely go to extremes in terms of temperature. Certainly on the lower end, right? So a lot of our switches will go to -40. Some of our devices will go to -50. And by far, I think the cold element is actually a lot harder than the heat element, because heat, it's how well you dissipate it. When you're talking about cold, it is how well you can heat it up, because a lot of these components have to, none of them can really work at -40. You're trying to dissipate some of that energy into heat. Some of our products have heaters. So going to space, right? Space is cold. I think
How do you know?
You could test it in Winnipeg.
I think to answer your specific
I was going to say.
Well, to answer the specific question, like this switch is fairly new, but we have some switches in the portfolio which are used by a company which sends vehicles to space. And we don't have visibility to the exact because of some of the confidentiality, but our portfolio of switches is being used in some way with the vehicles, or I cannot share more details, but it's used somewhere, which is related to space vehicles.
So that was literally a question, because when I worked many years ago at a WISP, the problems we had was everything freezing. So like certain things we had to paint with special stuff so that ice didn't stick to it, as well as we had cabinets that had heaters in them just so that the devices wouldn't freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and I think one key point that we would want to highlight is that this is the first product in the business unit, and maybe in Cisco, which eliminates the use of paint. So we understand that sustainability is top of mind for the customers. So by eliminating paint, we estimate to save around 10.5 tons of powder paint every year, which is a huge when we convert it to carbon footprints.
So to your question, how do I know space is cold? I don't really. I'm guessing that's my education, but I feel like space is cold. I don't have any experience with you.
I'm gonna ask in Quora just in case. Yeah.
Just one last question to the memory cards, yeah? You did a lot on the other components. Does it have to be a specialized memory card or is it out of the shelf?
So it doesn't have to be, right? It could be a normal SD card, but the SD cards that we sell with the lineup are ruggedized, right? So they will meet that same temperature requirement. If you just go buy one off Amazon, it may or may not perform the same way. But
they have failed in my smartphone, so...
Yeah, so I think for us, what we recommend to our customers is to use what has been tested extensively by our test teams. Now, if something else also works, and I don't say it will not, but when you go to tag for warranty and all stuff, and if the failure is created by a third-party devices, the warranty will be void. Yeah. So the recommendation is to use what has been recommended by the BU.
Yep, and when you go to order it, you can order the SD card with it, and it will show up in this box, and you just pop it in. And that's the next part I would like to say too is, specifically on that topic of SD cards, there is the functionality. Of course, this has flash built into it, right? You don't have to use the SD card, and sort of when you make those changes, it actually changes. It copies the configuration to both the flash and the SD card. So if the SD card were to fail, you still have that configuration, you can still boot from flash, right? So if it tries to boot from SD card, it doesn't work, it will boot from the flash internally and keep going. And that's kind of why I say, right, like, so after failure, they move the SD card to another switch. That's why you'd want some like an IT professional or OT professional to kind of follow up afterwards to say, make sure that it's all copied and it's going to boot right? But yeah, definitely the case that sometimes things happen.
I don't have a microphone, but I do want to ask a question. If
Sure.
it detects that the SD card failed, will it throw an error so that I can go fix it?
Yes, I want to say that it probably will throw as a syslog.
That would show you a log there.
Would you mind if I just grab it? Because you were holding it in this position, then I could see the color of the slides through it. So it's pretty cool that actually it's not as heavy as I thought it was going to be.
But no, I mean it fits for all those things: low temperature, vibration, all those things. One of the things that it is not kind of rated for is water, of course, right? You can see through it. We have other switches for that, but this part of the thermals on this switch is how it manages heat, right? And that's kind of that part of that grid design on top and bottom.
I have one last question to this. So in, let's say, IT world, we have certain life cycles, they are accepted. We know how long a switch could be, and then when it is end of life, we replace it and so on. But in the IoT space, often these things have completely different. They sometimes have decades, and so. Yeah. How long is the planning to support that box?
So for us, we recommend our customers that the life cycle would be 8 to 10 years, and historically, like the IE3100, which this switch is going to replace it. That was launched in 2012, and it is still active.
Okay.
So
because you're doing a bit more than, let's say, a classical catalyst switch.
Yes, because that is a key requirement for our industrial customers. Our enterprise customers, they are okay to refresh after 3, 4, 5 years, but our industrial customers, they require a longer life cycle.
Well, because the machine is anyway not going to change too much, right?
Right. So I think all that is kept into consideration when we design the switch, we have the components to make sure that it can support the life cycle that is being recommended.
And that's definitely a case, right? In a lot of industries, they don't have to change anything until they need to, right? And that's either because it fails and they can't get a replacement, or a lot of times they will just buy spares to make sure they can live it out. But if you have a product line or something and you may go 20 years right before you refresh that, and usually at that point it's a whole rip and replace, and it's more than just the switch, it's the entire control system. So
I would say instead of need, have to, because in most cases it broke, okay, we can replace it now. That's because you have no other choice. But in most cases you have boxes catching dust for ages and it takes a while.
So I've got a question about the administration of it. Do you have a centralized, like a management system, or do you aim to use DNA Center for this purpose of, having everything collected together.
For the switching, for
Yeah,
for
because
switching,
I mean, if you mentioned an amusement park and you have maybe 500 to 1,000 switches, you might want to have a centralized management of them instead of managing each individual one.
DNA center is being used for that.
Okay, so you aim to use DNA Center
Yeah,
for it.
we actually see the key point. What I guess he also mentioned is that the same iOS XC, so it gives the same capability, management by same DNA center. So you get your Catalyst switches and industrial switches in the same screen by the same tool.
Yeah, and I think, on top of that, building on top of DNA Center builds on the switches, right? You have the same automation that you have on your typical platforms, right? You have NetConf. So if you don't want to use DNA Center, in that may be the choice of a lot of kind of industrial environments because they want things to be static. They can definitely do that kind of pre-provisioning with the other kind of tools that we have in the Cisco kind of portfolio, right? It's NetConf, other ones. And, when I came from kind of theme park world, sometimes that was only one attraction, right? So an entire park, you have way more than 1,000 devices. You might have 500 per attraction, and that's kind of, I think, common to a lot of our customers, right? So definitely they're talking 1,000, maybe 5,000 in terms of a whole plant. So they definitely look at that and they say, what's the best way to deploy things like this? And using the automation is usually the answer. Either automation at the minimum level or DNA Center on top of that.
Are you looking to provide some more SDA functionality into it instead of having it just as an extended node? I'm talking about VXLAN encapsulation on the box itself instead of, relying it further.
Have a full node basically on.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you look at our entire portfolio today, for DIN rail, we do not have SDA fabricate support today. But on the rack mount IE9300, that switch can support that switch can be used as a SDA
Sure,
node.
but I could come up with some scenarios where it would actually be preferable to have one of these DIN
Yeah,
mounted.
so that is being considered. We do not have it now, but we do understand that that's a requirement for the customers.
Yeah, for sure.